Hey BookTube, guess where I was this past weekend? If you couldn't have guessed it by the title of this video and the preceding clips, I was at the Brattle Book Shop in Boston this past weekend. I was visiting a friend who lives in Boston, and I had to make the pilgrimage to the Mecca that is the Brattle Book Shop. Now, I was not able to meet Steve Donahue, the patron saint of the Brattle. Unfortunately, he had a conflict, so we couldn't meet. But I was not going to let that stop me from browsing and getting a few books of my own. First two books that I got in Boston that aren't Brattle. My friend who I was visiting gave me Leo Tolstoy's Master and Man and Other Stories, Butterscotch, Penguin Classic. I haven't read any Tolstoy, so I might start with this year. In fact, I haven't read any Russian literature at all, outside of Dostoevsky's White Nights, which isn't even a book, and Turgenev's A Month in the Country, I think. It's a play. So I'm woefully underread in Russian classics, so I need to do one of them at some point, so Tolstoy. And I found this at Goodwill, doing a little clothes shopping for paintball. But I picked up the Oxford Concise Dictionary of Literary Terms, which I figured would be a good reference in my journey, somewhat, of trying to become a literary critic. Not really. I don't want that to be my profession, but I would like to become better at criticizing literature. So, good reference material. This is by Chris Baldrick. It says Concise Dictionary, so I assume there's a larger one somewhere, but this is good enough for me for now. All right, moving on. Itch. Moving on to Brattle Books. I read this one already. This is The Land of Unreason by L. Sprague de Camp and Fletcher Pratt. This is a fantasy work which I think is aptly described as Alice in Wonderland meets A Midsummer's Night Dream. And the plot follows this U.S. diplomat during World War II who gets transported into the realm of fairyland by getting kidnapped by a drunk elf, which, for reasons he's drunk, is the main character's fault. And once in fairyland, he meets King Oberon and Queen Titania, and fairyland is in a state of decay because of this thing called the Shapings, which have altered the magic of the world, and things don't turn into what they should turn into, and they start to become ruined over time. So our main character, Fred, is enlisted by the monarchs to try and fix the problem. Now, this book was okay. It was a little like Alice in Wonderland in that it was mostly just a series of vignettes where the main character meets somebody, and then something happens, and he goes along and meets somebody else, and blah, blah, blah. So, yeah, my first Sprague de Camp / Pratt. I'm not turned off by either of the authors, but I can tell that this is not one of their greater works, I think. Just kind of campy, whimsical sci-fi. Not sci-fi, fantasy. Land of Unreason. I got that book because I wanted something to read on the train that wasn't large. Next up in the hall, we got Flannery O'Connor, Library of America, collected works, which are her novel, Wise Blood, her other novel, The Violent Bear to Wear, then 2 short story collections, A Good Man is Hard to Find, and Everything That Rises Must Converge, as well as her essays and letters. Now, I've never read Flannery O'Connor. I did have a short story collection of hers in my library, which has since gone into the Goodwill pile since I've got this beast. But yeah, like most Americans should have Flannery O'Connor on their shelf, as long as they don't hate her. So I don't know when I'll get to this, but it's nice to have everything in this one compact volume. It's almost 1,300 pages, even though it doesn't look too big. It's got the thin pages. So, Flan O'Connor. Now, this next book by Julio Cortázar is Cronopios and Famas. This is a short story collection translated by Paul Blackburn. Now, if you don't know, Cortázar is an Argentinian author from the Latin American boom who resided in Paris most of his life. But he's one of the great South American fiction writers of the 20th century. I've read from Cortázar All Fires, The Fire, and Other Stories. I read that in January, and it was great. I loved how easily Cortázar brought me into a story as the reader and kept me hooked, even without any real action happening in his stories. And a quote from Pablo Neruda, a famous Latin American poet, on the back of the book. He says, "Anyone who doesn't read Cortázar is doomed." So read Cortázar unless you want damnation. Penultimate book from the hall, hardcover Inez by Carlos Fuentes. I don't know much about this book. It's quite short. Oh, it's got my Brattle Book Shop bookmark, so you know I went there. But based on his 1975 novel Terra Nostra, Carlos Fuentes just catapulted into my top echelon of favorite authors. I haven't read anything great from him since. I've read a couple of small works, and I'm not sure that this will be different since I checked out the Goodreads reviews for this book, and it's well, the ratings are poor. I assume it's just moderate to mid in terms of quality, but it is a neat looking hardcover. Carlos Fuentes, probably out of print, so adding it to my collection. I'm sure I'll read it soonish since it's really small. But yeah, low expectations for this one. Inez Carlos Fuentes. And final book in the Brattle Book Haul, we have a massive book relating to literary criticism. And no, it's not a handbook or a guide or a dictionary. This is the Library of America's Edgar Allan Poe Essays and Reviews. It's laminated. So this is different than Library of America's, what do they have, like novels and stories for Poe? Hang on, let me close the window. So you might be wondering, like, what are essays and reviews? The first 95 pages are theory of poetry. Then the next almost 1,000 pages of this book is over 1,500 pages. The next 1,000 are reviews of British authors, and then British and continental, and then reviews of American authors and American literature. Then he goes into some magazine criticism and literary and social criticism before he goes on to some other random tidbits and essays and such. So I figure if I could read 1,500 pages of Edgar Allan Poe reviewing literature, I can review literature next. Maybe. So, yep. Here's the Brattle and other book haul. The Brattle was a really cool place. I didn't actually get up to the third floor. And it was raining, so there wasn't the outside station. But I enjoyed browsing. I would go again if I was in Boston again. So, have a good afternoon, or wherever you are. I'm going to go for a bike ride.